Okay, our next speaker is Emily Bamforth. So Dr. Emily Bamforth is the curator of the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum in Wembley, Alberta, that's near Grand Prairie. After completing a bachelor's degree at the University of Alberta in 2005, she went on to a master's degree at Queen's University in Queenston, Ontario, under Dr. Guy Narbonne. Her fieldwork in Mistaken Point, Newfoundland, explored fossils of the oldest complex multicellular life on the planet, from which she described 3 new species. Returning to her first love, dinosaurs, Dr. Bamforth completed a PhD at McGill University in Montreal under Dr. Hans Larsen, with the thesis based on the dinosaur mass extinctions in Saskatchewan. After graduating in 2014, she went to work as a paleontologist with the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, where her research focused on the late Cretaceous and early Cenozoic paleoecology and paleobotany, as well as mass extinction. She began as curator of the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum in 2022, where her work focuses on late Cretaceous paleoecosystems with an emphasis on understanding the relationships between paleoclimate, paleobotany, and dino ecology. Dr. Bamforth is an adjunct professor in the University of Alberta's Department of Biological Sciences and the University of Saskatchewan Geological Sciences Department, and enjoys working with graduate students. In her free time, Dr. Bamforth enjoys singing choirs, hiking, and performing with the Grand Prairie Opera.
Thank you very much. No opera singing today, unless you really want it. So last year, I had the distinct opportunity to speak to you about T-Rex, one of my favorite dinosaurs. And this year, I'd like to speak to you about another very famous dinosaur that we get here in Canada and why they are important. So, of course, this is a familiar face to many of us. Triceratops was first named by Othniel Charles Marsh in 1889. He originally called it Ceratops, but had to revise the name to Triceratops because they were finding increasing numbers of animals with horns on their faces. So Triceratops first described in 1889 and is today the second most popular dinosaur of all time after the T-Rex. So we're going to talk a lot about Triceratops today, so let's give it a proper introduction. Triceratops is an ornithischian dinosaur, one of the birdhead dinosaurs. It belongs to this clade of dinosaurs called the magnetocephalians. These are a really cool group of dinosaurs. They're characterized by having a shelf of bone along the back of their skull. The pachycephalosaurs turn this shelf of bone into a head dome. They're the dome-headed dinosaurs. And the horned dinosaurs, or the ceratopsians, turn it into a head shield. So, of course, Triceratops is one of these ceratopsian or horned dinosaurs. So the horned dinosaurs themselves can be separated into 2 groups. This, by the way, is a display at the Natural History Museum of Utah in Salt Lake City. These are skulls that are to scale. So really, really cool exhibit if you ever get a chance to go. So this demonstrates the 2 groups of the ceratopsians. On the one hand, we have what are called the centrosaurians. These animals generally are characterized by a large nose horn, smaller brow horns, and generally elaborate frill ornamentations. The other group of ceratopsians is known as the chasmosaurians. So the chasmosaurians tend to have really big, long brow horns and really small nose horns and less elaborate frills, just on general. Of course, we got a few kind of weirdos hanging out here too. But generally speaking, we have centrosaurians, we have chasmosaurians, and here's our Triceratops among the chasmosaurian group. So Triceratops is an absolutely enormous animal. Triceratops is the largest of all of the horned dinosaurs, and you can see just based on the relative size of that Triceratops skull to the comparator how big these animals are. So Triceratops was the biggest of all of the horned dinosaurs. It was also one of the very last dinosaurs to walk the planet. In fact, there is a Triceratops horn core that was found in Montana with the horn core actually touching the KPG boundary, the dinosaur mass extinction boundary. So it was one of the very, very last dinosaurs to walk the earth, and it was a contemporary of the T-Rex. So where do we find Triceratops? Well, like T-Rex, Triceratops is only known actually from a very small period of geologic time from a relatively restricted geological area. So we only find it in what's called the late Maastrichtian period. That is the very, very end of the Cretaceous period, the very end of the Mesozoic, or the age of the dinosaurs. So here's a couple of stratigraphic maps. There's southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan, Montana, and Wyoming. So I'll just throw on the KPG boundary. That's the dinosaur extinction boundary right there. I'm just going to highlight the formations where we find Triceratops. So here in Canada, we find them in the Lower Scholar Formation in Alberta, the Frenchman Formation in Saskatchewan, and then if we go down south into the States, they're found in the Hell Creek Formation in Montana and the Lance Formation in Wyoming. So again, these are some of the only formations where we find this very iconic dinosaur. Now, I just want to point out, because this is going to be important for later, if you take a look at the widths or the stratigraphic distances of the Scholar and the Frenchman, they are about half what we find in the Hell Creek and the Lance Formation in the States. We do have equivalent age rocks in Canada to the lower Hell Creek and the lower Lance Formation, but these are generally not fossiliferous. We don't tend to find fossils in things like the Battle Formation. So roughly, the Triceratops-bearing rocks in Canada, Saskatchewan and Alberta, are about half the size of what are found in the States. So just keep that in mind, because that's going to be important for later. The neat thing about Triceratops is where we find it, we find a lot of it. By volume, Triceratops makes up about 70% of the dinosaur material found in the Frenchman Formation in Saskatchewan, as well as the Hell Creek Formation in Montana. Where we find Triceratops, we tend to find a lot of it. To the point where if you're walking around Saskatchewan, for example, near East End or in Grasslands National Park, and you pick up a dinosaur bone, very, 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 very good chance that what you are holding is a Triceratops. So these are just some examples of those kind of weathered Triceratops bits that we find on the surface everywhere in the Frenchman Formation. Again, same in the Hell Creek Formation in Montana. So you might ask, why are there so many Triceratops? Why do we find so many of them in those formations while they occur? Well, the first thing is just Triceratops are big. So generally speaking, when we are talking about vertebrate animals, the bigger you are, the better your chance of getting into the fossil record. So just the fact that they're big means they get into the fossil record more often than, say, the smaller dinosaurs that are around. Now, this is one of the interesting points. Triceratops was the dominant mega herbivore in the late Maastrichtian period. So if any of you have ever done field work in places like Dinosaur Provincial Park or the Horseshoe Canyon or up in the Lofty Formation, you'll know that our dominant mega herbivore up there are hadrosaurs, duckbill dinosaurs. Pretty much everything you find up there, it feels like some days, is a hadrosaur. By the time you get to the late Maastrichtian, it's these ceratopsians, these horned dinosaurs that dominate. And there is some work to suggest that at this time, hadrosaur diversity and abundance is actually in decline, which allows things like Triceratops to become more dominant. So they are the dominant mega herbivore at the time. Again, there's more of them, so we find more of them in the fossil record. And of course, as we have to consider preservational bias all the time, our Triceratops just happen to live in places where the chances of being fossilized were high. So these are just some of the reasons why where we find Triceratops, we tend to find a lot of them. So there was a debate for a long time about how many species of Triceratops were there out there. So for about 100 years, Triceratops were collected in the States and a few in Canada as well. And paleontologists got really kind of cladistically happy, and they split them into 16 species, which is ridiculous. There's no way an ecosystem from that restricted geologic time, restricted geographic area is going to support 16 species of virtually identical animals. So what Goodwin and colleagues did in the 80s was to take a look at all of these 16 species of Triceratops, look at them a little more closely, run some more refined phylogenetic analysis, and they realized that no, we don't have 16 species. We actually just have 2. So there are 2 known species of Triceratops. Arguably the better well-known is Triceratops horridus. So it has a relatively small nasal horn. The orbital or brow horns face forward, face a little bit anteriorly, and they have a relatively longer nostrum. So from basically the nose to the beak there is longer relative to the other species. The other known species, and you can see it actually looks a little different, it's got a much broader nose horn that points forward. These orbital horns face upwards. A lot of them, they actually have an upward swoop to them, and a relatively shorter snout compared to Hornus. So these are two species of Triceratops. They were named primarily based on specimens from the United States. So you might ask, well, what do we have in Canada? Do we have one of these? Do we have both of them? Do we have something completely different? So this was work that I got to do when I was at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum in collaboration with some colleagues from the Canadian Museum of Nature. But before we dive into that, let me just introduce you to some of our Canadian Triceratops. This, I'm a little biased, but I think this is maybe the best Triceratops skull we have from Saskatchewan. This is a really neat skull. It was collected in 1967 by the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. This fellow here is named Albert Swanson. He collected a lot of stuff from Saskatchewan. And look, this is them collecting that skull. And you can see it is a perfect skull in the ground. This never happens in Saskatchewan. So the Frenchman Formation, we have a lot of like disarticulated stuff. So to be able to find a complete articulated skull like that was just amazing. You can see they're very serious people. You know, paleontologists just never have any fun in the field. So this specimen was brought back to the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. It was prepared, and now you can see a cast of this specimen both at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum in Regina as well as the QRS Discovery Centre in East End. Really neat thing about this skull is that it's got this really weird pathology. It's kind of like a chunk taken out of the frill. If you're interested in that, you can talk to Darren Tanky. He actually wrote a conference abstract about that a couple of years ago, like 2 decades ago now. But yeah, really, really cool specimen. So other Triceratops, these are Triceratops that I've had a chance to work on, things that I've really known and loved. This is one that we call Triceratops. So Triceratops was originally identified from Grasslands National Park in southern Saskatchewan in 1999. Kind of forgotten about. It was rediscovered by one of the RSM volunteers whose name was Josh. So we call this Triceratops after him. And we collected it as part of our Fossil Fever public guided excavation program in collaboration with the Grasslands National Park. So really cool specimen. It is a nasal horn, a nasal bone, and a partial frill. This was a relatively large specimen. One of the interesting things about this specimen is this frill appears to have fenestrae, holes in it, which is weird. That's not something Triceratops does. So we think this may actually be another species, which we'll talk about in a little bit. One of the coolest species of reputably Triceratops that we found, just a stone's throw away, like literally about 200 meters from that specimen, we have a specimen that we call the white trike. So called because the mud that cakes the bone is white in color, so the bone looks white on the surface. This is kind of a really cute specimen, just a little juvenile, maybe a subadult, but a relatively complete skeleton for the Frenchman Formation with a partial skull as well. So this was collected, again, relatively recently, just about a couple of years ago. This is one of my favorite Saskatchewan Triceratops. This is one we call Captain Crunch. As a testament to the shape of the bone, it is a pretty crumbly bone. The neat thing about Captain Crunch, which was collected just outside Grasslands National Park, you may get the sense that there's a lot of Triceratops in Grasslands National Park. You would be correct in that assumption. Captain Crunch is a huge Triceratops. I remember being in this quarry and having to collect a rib, and the rib was longer than I am tall. So this was a huge animal. This is the scapula, the shoulder blade. The shoulder blade is 1.5 meters long. So this is an absolutely monstrous Triceratops. One of the cool things is that in this quarry, as we were excavating this Triceratops, we came across this beautiful, fully articulated little turtle. Absolutely adorable, just that big. So Don Brickman and colleagues actually described this as a new species of Chynosturnian turtle. So that was a little bonus from this Triceratops quarry. So those are some of the recent Triceratops that we've collected. But people have actually been collecting Triceratops in Canada for quite some time. So there are many examples of historical Triceratops collected from Canada. And myself and my colleagues at the Canadian Museum of Nature, we were really interested in these historical specimens because they were collected without some critical data. So we wanted to go back and we wanted to re-look at these old specimens. So one of these was collected in 1962 by the Canadian Museum of Nature by a guy called Juan Langston. This is also Grasslands National Park. You see there's a theme here. So Langston and crew were out there. This was before it was a park. At the time it was known as the Killdeer Badlands. This was the specimen they collected. It does actually have brow horns, but they removed it as part of the excavation there. And this is a specimen that is on display in Ottawa. So if you go to Ottawa, if you go to the Museum of Nature in their dinosaur hall, you see the specimen. This one is from Saskatchewan, which is kind of cool. Interestingly, we also know that the Sternbergs were out in Saskatchewan in the 1920s. So the Sternbergs were a very famous American fossil hunting family. They were hired by the Canadian Geographical Survey to go out and collect fossils from Western Canada and bring them back out east for museums. So the middle brother, Charlie Sternberg, he was the one that was out in Saskatchewan, and he collected several specimens, including this enigmatic specimen here from 1921, also from the Killdeer Badlands, which would again eventually become Grasslands National Park. In 2020 and 2021, Jordan Mallon, Matt Rollison from the Canadian Museum of Nature, and me and a team from the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, we went out to re-find these old quarries. So the Long Langston quarry, relatively easy to find. They've thrown around a lot of garbage. Again, this was before it was a national park, but we were actually glad they did that because it made the quarry pretty easy to find. This 1921 quarry, though, was really problematic. So this is kind of us hunting for the quarry out there in, this was 2021. We knew what quarter section it came from, so, roughly a square kilometer. But the problem here was there was no badlands in this area. It was all kind of like these sort of low mounds on a grassland prairie. So we had to figure out which one of these low mounds someone could potentially have collected an entire Triceratops skull from. So we eventually landed on a depression in the ground that looked like that. All we had was this photo of the specimen, which of course shows none of the background, which wasn't helpful. Thanks, Charlie. But we actually went out there with Parks Canada and they brought a metal detector. So we're out there looking for bits of metal or anything. We found a whole bunch of rusted nails, which was kind of cool. We thought that might have been from them building crates. I actually found this thing here. This is a tin key. Back in the day when they opened a can of sardines, there was this key that you would turn to open the tin. That's what that thing was. So we got pretty excited. Unfortunately, there was no absolute dead ringers. So when you're looking for old quarries, one thing you really, really hope to find is old plaster to make jackets with. Plaster lasts forever. We didn't find any in this quarry. That doesn't mean it wasn't there. Maybe they were good at cleaning up. It's not something the Sternbergs are known for, but maybe in this case, they did a good job. But we're, I don't know, sort of 90% certain that this was the old quarry. So why do we do this? Why do we go back and look at these old quarries? We were looking for stratigraphic information. So when these were originally collected in the 1960s and the 1920s, they were sort of focused on getting the things out of the ground. They didn't really take great notes in terms of what stratigraphic horizon they came from. And it turns out that this is an important thing for identifying which species of Triceratops we had. So me and Jordan and Matt, we went out and we collected this missing data. And what this allowed us to do was to actually redefine our understanding of which Triceratops species was in Canada. So really getting at this question, do we have both here? Do we have one? Do we have the other? Do we have something completely different? We put this together in a study published in 2025. And we looked at all of the occurrence of Triceratops across Canada and the United States. And we were able to put them into a stratigraphic horizons. And what was interesting was that Triceratops pararsis, that one with the slightly larger nose horn, that was the only species that was known from Canada. So we do not have Triceratops horridus here in Canada, as far as we know. We just have this species, Triceratops pararsis. Triceratops horridus is an older species. So these two species are actually separated in time. Triceratops horridus being found only in those older rocks that you find in Montana and Wyoming. Triceratops pararsis only found in the younger rocks. This is what we call a chronospecies. And this is some evidence to suggest that Triceratops horridus actually evolved into Triceratops pararsis. This is supported by the fact that there's some intermediate type halfway between species, sort of in these mid-stratigraphic horizons here. So that was kind of cool. This is potential evidence of what's called anagenesis in the fossil record. So one species basically evolving into another. So we were also able to identify the Canadian Triceratops. To our knowledge, they are all this one species, Triceratops pararsis. So that was one of the cool studies we were able to do. Another cool thing we can look at in Triceratops is their growth. So because there are so many Triceratops out there, because there's so many specimens, they actually have a really good growth series preserved. So we know what they look like when they were babies. We know what they look like when they're adults. And there's a whole bunch of American specimens that kind of fill this gap. So this was a paper that was published in 2006. It was kind of a seminal paper, and it demonstrated that horned dinosaurs like Triceratops radically change their skulls as they get older. Like they basically entirely change shape. And in fact, I mentioned that at one time we had those 16 species of Triceratops. A lot of those species were actually juvenile Triceratops. So they were still Triceratops, just from a different growth stage. So this was really cool. Again, this was documented in Triceratops from the States. What we wanted to do at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum was to see if we could document a growth series from Canada. So again, the Triceratops we have from Saskatchewan is Triceratops pararsis. So we went out and we looked to see if we could actually construct a growth series on our Canadian material. So we were looking for 4 series. We wanted to find a baby, and of course we wanted to find an adult, and we wanted some sort of juvenile as well to kind of fill that gap. And we also wanted a subadult growth stage. So these were the 4 kind of stages of growth we were looking for in the Canadian material. And as it turns out, we started with the baby, and the baby is actually really quite well represented in Canada. So back in 1999, this adorable little horn core was found by a guy called Frank McDougall, a geologist who also did some paleontology from Grasslands National Park. That name comes up again. This is, again, a really, really adorable little horn core. Again, that's the horn over the eye. I don't know how many of you have seen Walking with Dinosaurs, the new one. The first episode deals with a baby Triceratops. This one's called Clover. Isn't she so cute? This little horn core could have come from an animal like Clover. So just fast forward to 1995. This was the time that Scotty the T-Rex was being excavated. In that same valley, Wendy Sloboda, who's a famous Albertan fossil hunter, she actually found another baby horn core. So again, the orbital horn from a very small individual. So the baby material in Saskatchewan was actually already pretty well represented. And I just want to throw this specimen in here too. So this one's got a cool story. This was a specimen that I found really close to the KPG boundary, again, really close to where Scotty the T-Rex was found. This is a really tiny Triceratops dentary, or lower jaw. And this was, again, found really close to the KPG boundary. And if any of you out there in the APS think this may look a little familiar, we collected this on an APS field trip to East End back in 2014. So some of you may have actually been there. And this is it relative to the size of an adult jaw. So this is a really, really cute baby Triceratops dentary. It's our only other piece of cranial material from a baby. So this is kind of a cool specimen as well. So our babies are pretty well represented. Up until recently, we got really excited. We actually had a better record of baby Triceratops than the Americans did, until they actually went ahead and found a complete skull, alas. So this was published in 2006. By the way, if this looks familiar to you, it's because you have a cast of it upstairs. So if you go up to the second floor here at Mont Royal, you'll see a cast of this little specimen right next to Nanotyrannus. If you want some paleontological debate today, you can head up there for that. But this little baby skull from Montana was the smallest Triceratops skull ever found. So we know that the little horn cores that we have are about the same size as the Montana specimen. So we do have that really little baby represented. So what did we have circa sort of 1997? We knew we had those little baby horn cores, and these by the way, are to scale. These are all the orbital horn cores, the brow horn over the eye. So we have these little babies here, and the adult has been well represented in Saskatchewan for a while. So we're still missing these 2 middle growth stages. We're still looking for the subadult, and we're still looking for the juvenile. So we went back and the RSM, and we looked back through our collections, and we identified another interesting Triceratops, again, collected from Saskatchewan. This one really close to where Scotty the T-Rex was found. And this was actually, I didn't know it at the time, this was another Triceratops that I had known and loved. This one was collected back in 2007 by the McGill Vertebrate Paleontology Field School. So this was actually my very, very first summer out in Saskatchewan with my supervisor-to-be, Dr. Hans Larsen, and they were digging up a Triceratops. And this Triceratops actually turned out to be a mostly complete skull. This one is nicknamed Sarah, so you can see it's got most of the face, both the orbital horn cores, the nasal, and most of the frill as well. So once this thing was put together, it was actually identified as a subadult. So this was one of our missing growth stages. So Sarah is a subadult Triceratops. Again, you can see a pretty complete skull there, and it fits in size with what Horner and Goodwin were calling a subadult Triceratops. Sarah, by the way, is on display at the Redpath Museum in Montreal, if you ever happen to go. That is where you can say hello to Sarah, the subadult Triceratops. So we now have the complete growth series except for this middle part here. We're missing that juvenile stage. And this one eluded us for a long time. I went through all of the collections looking for anything that could be called a juvenile Triceratops. Couldn't find anything, but then I struck lucky in Grasslands National Park. If you've never gone, you should go there. There's lots of cool Triceratops there. So this was actually a specimen that I collected as part of our Fossil Fever guided excavation program. This site is called the Garscale Microsite, one of our very famous sites out there. And one year, in 2017, I went and picked up this top bone here. I'm like, hey, this looks like a Triceratops horn core, except it's really tiny. That's kind of cool. So I took it back to the museum and we cataloged it and identified it. And I went back the next year, in 2018, and I found the other half of it, just lying on the ground. So that was great. And they glued back together perfectly. So this was the whole thing, well, you can see on the scale bar, not a very big Triceratops. This thing is kind of about the size of a cow, which sounds big, but not for a Triceratops. And so this was that missing juvenile growth stage. From those 4 specimens, we were able to basically reconstruct a growth stage of Canadian Triceratops, which is kind of cool. And again, you can see this is to scale. So you can see from how small they are from they're little to how big they are when they're adults. So they have a huge growth range. So that was kind of cool. We built the growth series of Canadian Triceratops. But, and this is a big but, this is one of the contentious issues in paleontology. Are these adult Triceratops really the adults? Is this the final growth stage? Or is there something else? So this is what's called the Great Torosaurus debate. So Torosaurus is another horned dinosaur from the same time period, also from the Maastrichtian, and it is incredibly rare. Like there's only just a handful of specimens of this species. Differs from Triceratops in that it has these big parietal fenestrae in its frill. Basically, the frill has got holes in it. There's a few differences in the rostral region as well. So the thing about Torosaurus was it was actually named before Triceratops. So it was found and named in 1891. If you remember, Triceratops was named in 1898. So this is actually an older species. And this specimen here this is called the Yale specimen at Yale University, as the name suggests. You can see it's actually a really monstrously huge animal, again, with those very distinctive holes in the frill. For a long time, these were considered to be separate species. And then in 2010, some American paleontologists decided to shake things up by suggesting that Torosaurus was actually a Triceratops, a really old Triceratops. And as Triceratops matured and got bigger, it actually developed these fenestrae in its hole. So that would mean that Torosaurus is not a unique species. It is just a really old Triceratops. The reason that they suggested this was at the time this paper was published in 2010, all of the known specimens of Torosaurus were absolutely ginormous. All of the Torosaurus specimens were bigger than any of the known Triceratops, or about as big. And they also took into account the thing that ceratopsians sometimes do this weird thing where they get holes randomly in their frills. We don't know why they do this. It seems to be some kind of bone resorption. This is a specimen that was originally called Nidoceratops. We now think that it is a Triceratops with a hole in its frill. If you remember that specimen that I showed you collected in 1967 that had the weird pathology in its frill, that's also maybe an example of bone resorption. So it's not completely crazy to suggest that Triceratops was maybe remodeling its frill as it got older. This was a very contentious debate in paleontology for a long time. One of the sticking points was that Torosaurus was named before Triceratops, which would mean, oh my goodness, Triceratops doesn't exist? What? So this was like paleo pop culture circa 1910, and there was hellfire and brimstone and weeping and gnashing of teeth, and Triceratops didn't exist because Torosaurus was named before it. And according to the Code of Zoological Nomenclature, the older species has to get the name if two species are synonymized. It was a whole big thing. But since then, that was 2010. Since then, we've made new discoveries, as we do as paleontologists. So this was actually work that I was also involved with, again, with my colleagues at the Canadian Museum of Nature. And we looked at a Canadian Torosaurus specimen. This was a specimen collected near East End. It was actually at the East End Historical Museum. And it's the frill of Torosaurus. Again, it's got those really classical fenestrae in the frill. And this thing is absolutely huge as well. So what my colleagues and I did was we did some histology. We basically cut part of the frill open and we took a slice through the bone. And what we were looking for was evidence that when this animal died, it was still growing. If it was still growing, it was not a senescent animal, which meant that it was not at the end of its growth stage, which is what you would expect if it was a mature Triceratops. And what we found was that we were able to find lines of arrested growth, which, big terminology, it basically just means this animal was still growing when it died. So this was not a mature Triceratops. This was an immature Torosaurus, basically. Since then, there's been more discoveries also made in the United States as well, including the discovery of a juvenile Torosaurus. So this is tiny. Now at the Denver Museum of Natural History, if we have a juvenile Torosaurus, they are not basically adult Triceratops. So I wouldn't say that this is a definitive nail in the coffin, and we never really have nails in the coffin in paleontology, but I think the jury is definitely still leaning to Triceratops being one species and Torosaurus being a separate Coeval species. But stay tuned though, you never know what we'll find. So I just want to leave you with this thought. Why do we continue to study Triceratops? We have literally hundreds of thousands of specimens of Triceratops now. We have many tens of skulls out there. Why do we still collect them? Why do we still care about them? So Triceratops remains a very important animal because it has a huge sample size. There's very few species of dinosaur where we have literally hundreds and hundreds of specimens. It was also the major megaherbivorous dinosaur right before that dinosaur mass extinction. It's really key for us to understanding what happened to those dinosaur ecosystems right before that mass extinction and following it as well. And also, it's important because it is a charismatic dinosaur. And charismatic dinosaurs matter to science. These are the 5 most popular dinosaurs of all time: T-Rex, Triceratops, Stegosaurus, Velociraptor, believe it or not, that's Velociraptor, and the long-necked dinosaurs as well. These charismatic dinosaurs are what really hook people. They really feed into that awe, that sense of imagination that really fuels interest in paleontology and by extension in science in general. So charismatic dinosaurs like Triceratops do still matter. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening. And if we have time for questions, I would love to take some.
Yes, we definitely have time for questions.
Hi Emily, thank you for the great talk. I was just wondering, because hadrosaurs seem to disappear at the very latest Cretaceous, is there any evidence, because we know angiosperms are beginning to radiate this time, is there any evidence of niche partitioning between Triceratops and Edmontosaurus to support that?
Yeah, good question. And so there is evidence of niche partitioning, not from the Frenchman, but from earlier time periods. So hadrosaurs and ceratopsians generally are not eating the same thing. And as you know, we do have a big hadrosaur at the time, the big Edmontosaurus, which was the biggest duck-billed dinosaur that ever lived. So they are there in the ecosystem. They're just not as common as the Triceratops. In terms of the angiosperms appearing on the scene, I think they did influence dinosaur faunal turnover, but it was earlier. It would have been kind of early to mid-Cretaceous rather than the very, very latest Cretaceous.
Thank you.
Do you know why the Battle River Formation and the White Mud Formation are not as fossiliferous as the Scotland and the
Yeah, good question. So the question is why those the formations underneath the Frenchman and the lower Scholard are not fossiliferous. It's because of the depositional environment. So these were kind of like deltaic, swampy environments. And if you think of North America at the time, the Western Interior Sea at the time was receding. And so those environments existed in Alberta and Saskatchewan, whereas they didn't exist further south in Montana. So it has to do with like the depositional environment rather than anything to do with the dinosaurs themselves.
Yeah, I'm curious, how common was this, the holes, the resorption in the frills? The reason I ask is my mom had to have false teeth because she had babies, and women who were pregnant, that's happened, and my sister-in-law had the same problem. So I'm curious, if it was 50-50, is that a sexual dimorphism clue, or I'm waving my arms, I'm curious.
So we don't know why they sometimes get resorption in their frill, and I should mention it's not common. It's a rare thing to find in ceratopsian, but we don't know why they seem to do it. It seems to be in older mature specimens, so possibly related to osteoporosis or something like that, but we just don't have a big enough sample size to be able to tell for sure.
Thanks. Do you have any idea why Triceratops became so charismatic in the popular eye?
I think, so Triceratops was one of the, it was right up there with T-Rex in terms of one of the first dinosaurs that really kind of captured the public imagination. Like you think of you know, the paleo art from like the 1950s and 60s, it's always T-Rex and Triceratops fighting. Triceratops, of course, is big. It's got very kind of elaborate looking, and I think it just caught people's imagination early. And because of that, it's never not being popular. But yeah, I mean, there's probably some deep societal reason for that, but I'm not sure what it is.
Hi. In the artwork you had for the baby, juvenile, etc., the juvenile seems to have horns that point backwards, and then when it becomes an adult, they point forwards. Is there a reason for that, or is that just the artist's choice?
Yeah, so those orbital horn cores, so there's two things happening with them. So the horn cores themselves are still growing. So particularly in Pararsis, they actually have a swoop to them. So they may actually start growing backwards and then grow forwards. Also, the entire skull is changing shape as well. So the position of those orbital horns is going to shift as the whole skull changes shape as well. But that was one of the revelations, was that their skull completely changes shape, and their horns completely change as they get older. And that again was some of the confusion as to how many species we had. It's just that they really change a lot as they get bigger.
Okay, I can't see any more questions, so thank you very much, Emily, for a great talk. And your subscription to APS, and Emily's our vice president as well, and as well as the book.